New drugs are always appearing on the streets, offering new highs, cheaper prices, and even legal options. One in particular that hit the headlines pretty hard last year was Mephedrone. Mephedrone was initially sold as a plant food, which is why it was able to be legally distributed, and it was very similar to MDMA and cocaine, and you could get it so cheap just online at the click of a button that it very quickly became one of the most popular drugs in the UK. It also, however, caused quite a stir amongst the public and the press, as it soon emerged to be quite a potentially risky substance. During the course of this documentary, I just want to look into the reality of what Mephedrone does to people and society. I wanted to explore the way it was dealt with in the press at the time of when it was being legalised, and I just generally want to find out a little bit more about the substance. I started by talking to a pharmaceutical graduate, Adam Frost, just to find a little bit more about the drug.
Mephedrone is a synthetic stimulant that falls into the amphetamine and the cathinone class. The structure of mephedrone is a relatively simple compound, made up of an aromatic ring, a ketone functional group and an amine. It's not too dissimilar to the structure of ecstasy in terms of how it would affect the user. Being similar to other drugs like ecstasy and cocaine, someone taking mephedrone may experience feelings of alertness, euphoria, becoming talkative, or displaying some kind of erratic behaviour. Despite the similarities and the seemingly positive effects, we still have to remember that we're dealing with a completely new and potentially risky compound. The interesting thing about mephedrone is its structural similarities to methamphetamine or crystal meth. This suggests that it acts more like methamphetamine than amphetamine. Unlike amphetamine, crystal meth possesses a methyl group which helps carry the drug through the blood-brain barrier. This gives a more prominent effect on the brain and an addictive nature to the drug, and is also apparent in the structure of mephedrone, which would suggest that it could act as a far more addictive substance. If we're looking at it in terms of how risky it is to the user, aside from the addictive nature of the drug, then judging by similarity to other drugs and to reports by other users, you can expect dehydration, heart palpitation, headaches, or secondary effects like fatigue or potential depression. It's hard to say what the long-term effects of mephedrone will be, as it's still a relatively new drug, but as with all drugs, there's an associated risk involved, and from what we know about mephedrone so far, it should definitely be taken seriously.
So clearly mephedrone is a dangerous drug that needed to be taken seriously, but what interested me was the way that it was portrayed in the media. There was so many stories coming through about people dying from taking the drug, and it was instantly branded as this killer drug. But as the story started to play out, I found it quite interesting with what developed. This is one of the first stories that really caused a lot of uproar in the whole mephedrone situation, about these two kids that reportedly died after taking mephedrone on a night out. What I find quite interesting is how this developed as the story continued to emerge. This is a following headline of a few weeks later that shows that mephedrone was not the cause of death for these kids, and it actually even says here that they didn't even have it in their system. So what I find myself thinking is, how can you make such a gross misjudgment? How can one minute you're saying they died from a substance and the next minute it shows that they didn't even take it? And it just really made me think, are we just using scare tactics to create a situation, to do something in a way that the government or maybe the media want to do? And it just didn't really add up to me. I didn't understand why there wasn't just more honest advice and education about these drugs being put forward, so that anyone that would take it would know what they were doing, or it would just genuinely deter people because they would know the real risks, not saying, oh, you're going to die from it. And I just don't understand why there wasn't more of this honest information coming out. I was completely in favour of the legalisation because it's clearly a destructive substance, but there just should have been more real information being put across. I was quite interested in this way the media was portraying it, and to how we as a country deal with the drug situation. So I spoke to Carmel Clancy, who's an advisor in the ACMD, just to find a little bit more about how all this works.
On the case of Mephedrone, there have been increasing concerns with regards to this. As you know, it was nicknamed Meow Meow. It had, sort of come up in the media. There had been some various stories that had come through that people were overdosing, dying, and so forth. And so there was a concern that there was a lot of drug-related death related to that particular substance. One death can be considered too many. However, if you're looking at it from the perspective of population studies and looking at what other risks exist in society in terms of deaths to do with other drugs or indeed other activities, then perhaps it was an overexposure of the potential. Ultimately, risk is very subjective. You can take something as mundane as deciding to go across the road at a traffic light where there are clear signals that give you permission, i.e. green man, red man, and you can say, I'll wait for the green man, and you can make that decision. Or you can go 2 or 3 feet down from there and dodge the cars because you feel you have a good sense of the car distance and whether you're fast enough and whether you can make it and so forth. People have different perception of what risk means. Notwithstanding, however, that when it comes to trying to give out messages to young people from a public health point of view, some people have a view that scare tactics work. If you're going to try and put people off taking drugs, maybe the best thing is to terrorize them, so to speak, with information. Whereas the evidence with regards to terrorizing people with information doesn't work. And if it grabs a headline that a soap star has taken a certain drug and overdose, that's going to sell a paper. That's what they're going to do. So they will perhaps portray certain drugs or certain situations that are associated with drug use purely from a sensational point of view, as portrayed by some of the straplines in tabloids, that it was this killer drug, making it out that first time you take it, or that whatever, you would be immediately sort of, or it was implicated, as you say, in 39 deaths, and it turned out that wasn't the case, probably does imply that there was an oversell in terms of what the media said. So I think, what I'm saying is the risk is there. There's no question. There's the risk. The risk exists. That's why it was made illegal. And the fact that it was put into a Class B gives you an indication of how serious the drug is and how serious the drug, if you took it, has in terms of its risks. But is everybody taking it? Is everybody dying from it? No. If you're looking for a solution, the solution is in education.
Ultimately, newspapers are always going to put forward headlines that are there to sell, and drugs are a topic of mass interest, so I'd imagine we're always going to see this sort of media exaggeration going on. But what the whole situation with Mephedrone really showed to me was that even though this is going on, we need more active education and information about the reality of the drugs and the situations in which they incur. I mean, you can find this information that will give you good, honest advice about the realities of these drugs, but unfortunately the things that are really shoved in our faces without having to actively look for it tend to all be a little bit oversold and over-exaggerated. I was quite interested about what the realities of Mephedrone were from a user's point of view, and someone who had really seen how it is on a personal level. So I caught up with a student who had felt the full effects of the wave of Mephedrone that hit last year, just to find a little bit more about the reality of the situation.
I started taking Mephedrone when I started making friends with a certain crowd at university last Christmas. We had about 3 weeks of holiday where there was nothing to do, and I had friends selling it to me for like £1 a gram, and people were buying it online for £20, so it seemed a little bit too good to be true, so we just thought, let's go for it. Your heart races all the time and you rush, and sometimes your eyes go a little bit shaky, but it's fun. Like it's sort of like a strange feeling you're not used to, but it's really fun and exhilarating at sometimes, and you're feeling this euphoria you wouldn't feel normally. It's until the morning when the sun rises and you start getting a come down that things get a bit rubbish and you realise, hang on, I need more, and it's whether you can get more that turns the situation from being good to bad. I saw people I knew from being happy and outgoing, confident, to becoming very reclusive and not really understanding what was going on in their head, and people would look so sort of confused and lost in their own little worlds, and you try and have a conversation with someone and they wouldn't understand what you're saying, even though you're the one who's refreshed and being the normal person, I guess. They just hadn't eaten all day. You'd try and give them a cup of tea or something to wake themselves up and try and get some fresh air with them, and they couldn't really respond. Basically, it went from having fun in halls to it going on for weeks and weeks on end, and friends would just be staying up for 6 days straight, no sleep, not eating. You'd see how they went sort of sallow in their cheeks and lost weight, and it was quite horrible to watch, but they still thought they were having a good time. It took a few big things like the police getting involved and a good friend of mine ending up in hospital because he got so depressed. And out of all of it, I think it has changed the majority of my friends. It wasn't them, it wasn't who they used to be, and slowly they grew out of it and it got illegalised and people started just being normal again and getting their lives together and eating and putting weight on. And even people who knew us but hadn't really been around us at the time would say, oh, you look so much healthier, like what was wrong before, like were you all right, like what have you been through? And you wouldn't really know what to talk about. You'd just sort of shrug your shoulders and just go off with your friends again, I guess.
This just shows how potentially dangerous mephedrone was and is, and that awareness like this should really be communicated to the public, and especially young people. I mean, if people were told about how it can affect you and the people around you in the real ways like this, that should be enough to deter people. No one wants that to happen to them and the people around them. But if the media keeps throwing all these scare tactics at us, I actually think you're less likely to believe it, because nowadays we hear that everything is going to destroy our lives, and I just somehow think it's a bit counterproductive. I mean, at the end of the day, all we've got to do is work with it and educate and try and put forward as much real knowledge to people as possible so they can make their own decisions and try and stay as safe as possible. I mean, we are always going to experiment with drugs as human beings. We will always explore that, and we've seen this echo throughout time for as long as we can remember.
As far back as the 16th century, there is evidence of recreational drug use for pleasure, primarily originating from opium. This has since continued for centuries, regularly seen over time influencing artistic works like Samuel Taylor Coleridge's opium-fueled poem Kubla Khan.
Weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed, and drunk the milk of paradise.
Even Shakespeare was rumoured to have been influenced by opium, marijuana and cocaine. As time went on, legislation was passed, opinions developed and more knowledge was gained. Yet more and more people continued to consume and new drugs continued to emerge. Drugs have evolved along with people and have always played a big part in our way of life. The current state of media saturation and celebrity glamorization really doesn't help, but time shows that people in some way, shape or form will always indulge and experiment with drugs.
So maybe we just need to adjust the way we deal with these situations, because they aren't going to go away. But with the hierarchy and the way things work, there may not be that much chance of change. Maybe it might take some more independent organisations becoming more prominent, or maybe we'll just evolve over the time and learn from our mistakes. But for that, we'll just have to wait and see.